I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on the Spotlight Network, we're stepping into a luminous and lyrical journey with award-winning poet Douglas Cole. His latest collection is called The Cabin at the End of the World. It invites readers to explore the beauty and complexity of life through dreamlike prose poems influenced by the greats. With vivid, mysterious imagery and meditations on Zen, nature, and humanity, Cole crafts a vision where the sacred meets the everyday, right here in our world. We're delighted to have this very talented author join us here today on Spotlight. We thank the team at Atticus Publishing for helping us put him in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support authors like him by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing his amazing book. The links are below this interview. And be sure to download the Spotlight Network TV app streaming on Roku, Apple TV, and Amazon Fire TV. Doug, great to see you here today on Spotlight. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful.
Wonderful to have you on the show. It's a beautiful book, very inspired. Let's explain to the folks at home, first of all, what a prose poem is.
Oh, well, I guess it's poetry that's sort of disguised as prose. It sits on the page looking more like prose, perhaps, than the maybe fragmented or broken lines. And that's I think, one of the defining features of poetry is that its attention so much on the line. Each line, there's a beautiful poet I love by the name of Theodore Retke, and he has this saying. He says, each line of a poem should be a poem. So that each line that you read should have its own like beautiful integrity and vision imagery and sound and way in which it works on its own perfectly. And and so the prose poem I think stretches the line out, or it's more sort of formally or in terms of genre looks more like prose. It's more like a paragraph or a block. And so for me, the art of it was to try to get that slightly more informal conversational language and voice of a prose poem, but still kind of keep in mind that each line has its own artistic integrity and beauty.
Exactly. That's a beautiful definition. I love the
Thank
fact,
you.
and it's very, very true. I never thought about that before, that every line of poetry is beautiful. These woods are lovely, dark and deep. I mean,
Mm.
just that alone is a beautiful poem. You don't have to go any further than that. I love the title of your book, The Cabin at the End of the World, because the end of the world kind of was coming out of the blue. You know, you expect the cabin at the end of the woods, the cabin at the end of the meadow. Tell us a little bit about why it's called the cabin at the end of the world.
Well, I like the fact that that's kind of an ambiguous location, both physically and in time, right? The end, where is the end of the world physically, for those of us who believe it's a sphere.
Yeah.
The end of the world is where is it? It's nowhere, right? So that's the
Right.
fun, the poetic ambiguity of that idea. But also, a lot of these poems were composed, in the years of the, pandemic and post-pandemic and all of that. So the end of the world, and I don't know, even now there's kind of this vibrant energy of anxiety I think we're walking around with today in terms of, climate crisis and political upheavals that are happening, that it feels, the end of the world. There's kind of also this fin de siècle notion that seems to recur from time to time, generation to generation. Like the end of the world is always looming right before us, whether it's a Y2K or, 2012. We've heard different versions of how it will happen. And so we all kind of carry that in our minds. And so that's part of what the cabin at the end of the world is.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of people out there right now who feel that we are at end times, that this is the end of the world. But we shall see. Only time will tell, to use a very hackneyed phrase from journalism. Let's talk a little bit about your background in Zen philosophy and how it shapes the poems in this collection.
Well, that's been something that's just been pieced together over years, a little bit of college here and, some reading of Alan Watts over here and D.T. Suzuki, my worldview or philosophy or ontology or whatever is kind of a soup of different influences. Um, Zen, yeah. How did Zen come into my world? Reading a little bit of Kerouac back in the day. Dharma bums. It's been percolating in the culture, ways, especially on the West Coast, coming in the 60s and 70s. And so, yeah, it always Buddhism, Zen Buddhism always felt like a pretty beautiful and simple, but not simplistic way of looking at the world. Often people talk about it as more of a philosophy than it is a religion, a kind of a way of being in the world where you're absolutely very much more present in the moment. And that's kind of your consolation in a way, to be actually present. And you're in the midst of what's happening all the time, which is a collapsing of a moment and a becoming of a moment. And I kind of love that sort of guide to just be awake as much as possible. And I teach as well. And I think that in terms of learning how to read and really understand, that's a good way to approach thinking and reading as well as being, is to be as kind of awake and aware as you can be.
Exactly. When you were talking before about the end of the end of the world as you know it, the song, it's the end of the world as we know it, went through my head. And it's
Yeah.
funny, music and poetry obviously are very interrelated. Songs are basically poems that are sung. Talk to us a little bit about the role music plays in the musicality of your language.
Oh, man. Well, that goes back to one of the first poets I began to read more seriously, introduced to me by my good friend Charlie Steele, Richard Hugo's poetry, actually. And he has a book called The Triggering Town. And he says that the music of poetry, should be sort of the primary driving force. He talks about, the role of truth in poetry, telling the truth, or art telling the quote unquote truth, and then the music of it. So that if you're following the music, you might say something that's not technically true, but musically, the guide of the music is towards a better or bigger or more profound kind of truth. And so the musicality can be a creative way that the poet is actually being entertained in the process of creating too. So you're listening, follow the sound of the music. And it's kind of always been a sidecar to my way of thinking about the writing, even in the prose, even when I'm writing prose. And I've been fortunate enough, even in the last couple of years, to work with Joe Maida, who runs the online journal called Jerry Jazz Musician.
Mm.
And I write pieces for his journal that are kind of prose poetry. They're poetry, but they have I lean into the prose quality, the narrative quality, and um, and I set them to music. So
Mm.
I invite friends of mine to play music while I read them, and we post them online. And so music's always important. I think, like you said, music lyrics are sung poetry. And poetry, I think, is that kind of living musical energy that's inside all of the language. And I've often said I think there's not a lot of difference between writing poetry and prose, in the sense that you're always in that magic of music.
And I agree. I think for both to be effective, whether it's prose or poetry, they both have to be lyrical.
Yeah.
And I think there is something so captivating about music. If you think about it, that's one art form we consume constantly.
Yeah.
We can be watching TV and listening to music, driving and listening to music, running and listening to music. I don't think there's any other art form that's consumed more while doing other things than listening to music. So music is intricate to our souls, our psyches, and our minds. Let's talk a little bit about the themes of your book, what you cover, what you hope people experience, what you hope they feel when they read your prose poems.
Ah. Well, in the cabin at the end of the world, of course, when they enter in, they're thinking about that end of the world and what that means in terms of time and space and that kind of thing. So it's got that energy. You're entering that kind of a dream when you enter it. But I kind of like in terms of the Zen Buddhism, I like the notion of Shiva that comes out of Hinduism, actually, parent to Buddhism. This notion, Shiva, the god Shiva, that destroys things, but in the process of destroying them is really just sort of clearing the way for something new to be created. And, I present my understanding of Hinduism and Buddhism with limits, of course. But that idea to me, I think, is what I want to have the reader sort of pull out as they journey through the book, is this idea that even if things are collapsing, even if things are ending, they are ending in a way that things are ending at all moments, but things are coming and being created and rising at all moments within that as well. So that's, I think, a kind of important meditation that was part of how I created a lot of the work, or what drew the particular poems that came together in that collection. Yeah.
Absolutely. Talk to us a little bit about this section, Windows of the Sea.
Well, Windows of the Sea, I stole that line.
Borrowed, no, nothing stolen, everything's borrowed.
Well, I tell my students to read as thieves. I stole that one from Bob Dylan, actually. He's got that in a Desolation Row, between the windows of the sea where lovely mermaids flow. Um, yeah, that's an interesting section. In some ways, that's where the poems in the book began. Windows of the Sea. Those poems were largely composed on a brief journey, a trip that I made with my partner up to a little island called Orcas Island here in the Puget Sound, or in the San Juans. And I was sitting in a place called West Cove, which is the first poem of that section. And that's where, and I was reading the poetry, the Chinese poetry translated by David Hinton, and these cherry blossoms were falling into my book, and in a moment I was thinking, oh, I'm going to leave them in there, and in years
Yeah,
down the line
present.
I'll open it and find them. And yeah, between the windows of the sea, just for some reason that abstract, weird image, the windows of the sea, what is that? I felt like that's where I was because I was on an island, right? And I'm between two sides of the sea in a way, and it's just spatially and one writer called a bunch of my work a couple of years ago, has called it a kind of dirty surrealism. And so that surrealism is kind of a big part of what I'm after too. And so that image of the windows of the sea, the location of West Cove, Orcas Island, that's kind of the pinpoint. And in some ways, if I can hold up that's in some ways that's where I see. I sort of in my mind envision that's where this is. It's that west. It's where I'm looking from at that point. And so a lot of the poems in that section come out of being there, and also that becomes the location in a fashion uh, for the cabin at the end of the world. That's where it is in a way. It's between the windows of the sea, so it doesn't exist anywhere really, but it's also on the west cove of Orcas Island, and it's in that little cabin on the cover where you can go and sit and be at the cabin at the end of the world.
That cabin is a place I'd like to be. I mean, when I looked at your cover, I thought it was very dreamy, very imaginative, and it did kind of look like at the end of the world. Tell us a little bit about that artwork. Is it have special meaning to you? Is it something you contracted out for the book, or tell us a little bit about how that came about?
The cover. This is the first one I've actually commissioned. I asked my partner, Jennifer Merritt, to do a painting for me. I told her that I wanted something that would be related to, at first I was kind of cagey about it. I said I want it to be related to an idea about a cabin at the end of the world. I just gave her the title. I didn't tell her it was going to be for a book or anything. And she started working on it, and then I felt like I want to give her more, so I gave her a copy of the manuscript. I told her where it was going, which I don't know, that might have added pressure. But anyway, and then she painted this. And actually, if you look on the wall behind me there's the whole thing.
Wow,
So
that's
I've only
wonderful.
used a selection of it. And yeah, that image, that particular image there, just sort of, and oh, I actually like this is the hardback version, and so you can't
Mhm.
quite see it, but in the paperback version, you can see that there's a moon behind the cabin, and so that's where you get
So
that
that's
light.
beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, no, she's a beautiful artist, super talented. And so, yeah, I asked her to make that, and then I gave her the poetry to read to see in what ways those words and music, could inspire the painting.
I love the fact that you gave her very few parameters when it came to creating it, because when I work with fellow artists, I do the same thing. I'm like, here's my idea, what's yours?
Yeah.
Instead of like, what I want to see is this, and what I want, no, borrow their brain. Like you said, shoplift from others. It can be very, very helpful in collaborating with other artists. I know it's like asking to choose among children, but do you have a favorite poem in this collection? And again, I don't want to put you on the spot, but would you like to read it for us?
Well, I'll read you a poem. I can't read you, I don't think my favorite one because it would take about 15 minutes.
Okay,
That's a,
sounds good.
but yeah, I've got the one longer poem uh, in in the Talking Stone section called Distances, which one reviewer that has reviewed the book says that a lot of it does read like COVID poetry, which is kind of true. That's probably the one poem in there that kind of captures some of that energy and feeling, even though I've kind of tried to erase all the tracks of COVID-ness about the, it's not all COVID poetry anyway like that. But kind of the feeling, I don't know if people can remember back to those early days when we were shut down. But one of the poems that I like to read that's sort of a good way to enter the collection, and it's a good example of the prose poetry that I'm after. Now you kind of see a picture of it there, the block shape of it, the longer
Yeah.
lines of it. And it's also the first poem. It's called A Game of Chicken, and it sort of captures kind of the world that we're entering in this collection. When the train still came through town along Sandpoint Way, up at the north end of the lake, we used to swing out on a rope tied to a tree branch above the tracks in a game called Chicken. And one boy named Stuart, who was often hounded by the pack, timid, backed away up the muddy hillside until, taunted, one day he at last took hold of the frayed rope just as the engine passed, and we watched him arc out like we had done. But at the point directly over the train, he turned to face us. And what can I say about that expression and the way it seemed like a final stab as he let go or slipped, who could know, and was carried off as we scattered fast and only heard the rest of the story later on the news. But among us, we never said a word about it ever.
Wow, that's really very, very powerful. It kind of like, sets you up on this great nostalgic trip, and then it seems to turn very tragic at the end. Is this based on a real life story, your experience? Tell us a little bit about the backstory on that.
Yeah, I've been asked. I've been asked, with some hand wringing almost. Is that true?
Yeah.
My response is the important parts are, yeah.
Yeah.
Where I live, Lake Washington is a beautiful lake here in Seattle, and there did used to be a train that went around the north end of the lake, Burlington Northern, I think it might have been. Anyway, and as a kid, we used to walk along the tracks, and there was a spot along the tracks where, train had gone off. There'd been a crash, and I just remember we used to poke around, and we were looking for pieces of the disaster. There
Mm,
was something about as kids, there was a little morbid, and yeah, that was the place we went. We played war, threw rocks at each other, and just I'm surprised we made it out of there alive, any of us, but yeah, that's kind of where that story came from. Stuart was actually, he's based on a character. He did not die.
right.
Like you guys,
That's good.
that's
That's
sort of,
good.
people get relieved and then they also get a little mad when they find out like,
Well,
how do you,
well, it kind of, like you said, when you and I were kids, we played much more roughly than kids play today. We did play by train tracks. We did go into the woods. We did make crazy slides and crazy swings and crazy ramps and did things that seemed to defy death.
yeah,
And, there was always, not in my group, but somebody I heard of somebody who, broke his neck or fractured his skull or something like that, which might have been folklore as well. But it does kind of capture that essence of kids trying to push the edge of what they can do to stretch the limits. I think that really is a very cool poem and a
thank you.
very great example of prose poetry
Yeah.
because it tells a story and you wouldn't even necessarily know it was a poem. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that
No, I hear that in the best way.
it's very, very lyrical prose. The name of the book we've been talking about today is The Cabin at the End of the World. It is written by a terrific poet and author. His name is Douglas Cole, and the book is a profound poetic journey through the mystery and majesty of human existence. Doug, thank you so much for joining me here today on Spotlight.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate your time, your wit, your wisdom, and your insight. To the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time until next time on Spotlight.